Last week I asked the question, why are you a disciple of Jesus Christ? And I suggested that at least one primary reason or goal of being a disciple was to be made whole, that is, complete, that is, fulfilled. Having the purpose for which we were created, that purpose which Jesus has restored to us, has redeemed in us, is redeeming in us, to bear the image or the likeness of God to all the rest of creation. You know, I heard from some of you some great reasons why you are a disciple, like because Jesus called you and you've answered, or to bear the image, the likeness of Christ. So I want to explore this a little bit more this week. And let's begin with what it meant in Jesus' day to be called to follow Him. Jesus called disciples to follow Him. So what does that mean to you? Or what has it meant to you to follow Jesus? The rabbi-disciple relationship in Jesus' day was pretty well established. It was much more than an education model of a teacher passing along information to a student. Instruction was certainly a key component, but the classroom of a disciple and their rabbi was all of life, all the time. For Jewish people, from the earliest times, education has played a key role and has always begun in the home with children at a very young age. This is in keeping with God's instruction through Moses that parents were to teach the commandments, as Deuteronomy 6 says, diligently to your children. And you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. Professor Marvin Wilson, in his seminal book, Our Father Abraham, writes, "The primary purpose of education in Bible times was to train the whole person. The aim of learning was holiness in living, to be set apart unto God in every dimension of life." Shmuel Safrai, the great professor, has written, although the purpose of such study was to learn in order to practice, Torah study was also considered an act of worship, serving to unite man with God. By Jesus' day, schools outside the home had developed. They were often attached to a synagogue or a particular sage or master teacher, that is a rabbi. The school that young children began with, around the age of about 5, was called Beit Sefer, that is, house of the book, where memorization and study of the Torah, the book, would take place. In the Galilee, it was believed that both boys and girls would attend this house of the book, this primary school. At the age of about 12 or 13, boys would begin an apprenticeship in a trade, and girls would prepare for marriage and the keeping of a household. If there was interest and encouragement because of your particular aptitude for study, boys could continue in Beit Talmud, that is, the house of study. Here, students would memorize other Hebrew scriptures and teaching from sages that had been passed down through the previous of about 200 years or so. At the age of about 15, the very best students would be encouraged to seek out a rabbi and to follow in his footsteps. They would have to prove their willingness and worthiness before a rabbi would say to them, "Come, follow me." The rabbi-disciple relationship was an intense one, to say the least. As a disciple, your rabbi would become your father more so than your earthly father. You served him, and you learned every aspect of his knowledge and his understanding of Scripture, as well as his mannerisms, his ways and reasons for everything he did. Lois Warburg and Ann Spangler have written, to follow a rabbi meant something other than sitting in a classroom and absorbing his lectures. Rather, it involved a literal kind of following, in which disciples often traveled with, lived with, and imitated their rabbis, learning not only from what they said, but from what they did, and from their reactions to everyday life, as well as from the manner in which they lived. The task of the disciple was to become as much like the rabbi as possible. Traveling with Ray Vanderlaan in Israel, I would often hear him say, "It wasn't enough to know what your rabbi knew. You wanted to be who your rabbi was." Safre has written, "Study by itself did not transform a student into a disciple. For one thing, there were subjects about which you could not systematically learn. They could not systematically be studied or explicitly enunciated, and subtle spiritual matters could be learned only by participating in the Master's life. To bear his image, display his likeness, to become fully like him in every way, no matter the cost. That is what the call, 'Come follow me,' meant. From this intensity of relationship, this literal following in the footsteps of your rabbi, came the idea you were to cover yourself with the dust of their feet and drink in their words thirstily. Jesus came calling disciples to follow me, and was clear that the cost to follow, to be his disciple, was great, a cost that needed to be carefully considered, to be counted beforehand. He spoke of the depth of intended relationship as abiding in him, and that his words were to abide in them. He said to know him was to know the Father, and towards the end, he told them he considered them not just servants, but friends. Jesus' disciple, John, understood this knowing Jesus as an abiding relationship that meant keeping Jesus' word in the obedience of whole life living, having God's love perfected. That word is that word teleos again. That is filled full, made whole, made complete in their lives. And walking in the same manner as Jesus walked. The Hebrew concept of knowing, yada in Hebrew, isn't merely about intellectual knowledge. In Hebrew, the thought is to know something or even someone was about experience. Rather than merely an intellectual exercise, to know God and be known by God is meant to be experiential, personal, even intimate in relational encounter, engagement, and attachment. To follow Jesus was to know Jesus in this manner, to become like Jesus. And as Jesus said, to know Jesus is to know the Father. To know the Father is the purpose for which we are made. Abiding, walking, to know and be known. Learning to be Christ-like, to bear the image, live out his likeness. To be Christ-like, so that the rest of the world would know, yada, yada, yada.